and that is Anne, and that is Anne Urbancic. Perfect timing. The recently retired Mary Rowell Jackman Professor of Humanities at Victoria College here at U of T. So when I first met Anne, I already knew that she had this rather enviable reputation as a teacher, as an innovative and beloved teacher, not just at U of T, but elsewhere as well. But I didn't know until recently that she was actually awesome. Now, I want you to know that according to ratemyprofessor.com, 44 of the 50 students in her last undergraduate Vic 1, I think, class gave her the 5 out of 5 rating of awesome. Wow. Deserves a hand. That's great. And they did this, I read, because of her contagious enthusiasm for and deep knowledge of her subject, as well as her much appreciated compassion and empathy for her students. So Anne is well known for actually getting undergraduates into the archives, often against the wishes of the archivists, but she has done this to do so they can do original research on their own as well as in collaboration with her. So it's no surprise that she's won many teaching awards. But this interest in the archives and historiography more generally guides her research as well. It has resulted in the online publication of the vast, and I mean vast, correspondence of the Italian Tuscan author Mario Pratesi, whose letters and notebooks were found in Toronto and subsequently donated to the E.J. Pratt Library because of Anne, I believe. Her research interests have focused on Pratesi and on the writing of Anni Vivanti, both of whom she has written and published extensively. And together with our own Juliana Cates, Anne has translated, I think, 3 Italian novels and 2 plays. Am I right? Did I get them? That's impressive. But lately, she has also turned to examining Italian foodways, Italian cookbooks, but not just Italian, Canadian too. She's interested in how we, as she puts it, practice the spaces of everyday life. And if you're interested in doing that and looking at how Canadians do that in terms of food culture, where else would you look but to today's topic? So please welcome Anne to talk to us on Large Double Double, how Tim Hortons coffee ritualizes Canadian identity.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was a very kind introduction indeed. And also thank you to all of you for the invitation to speak to Senior College. I'm really excited to be a member, but I'm even more excited to be here today to share my research with you. It's part of my academic work on food and foodways, which I took up quite unexpectedly when somebody couldn't teach a course in 2013, and they asked me to teach a course on Italian food. And here I am to talk to you today about a very successful business venture, likely in your neighborhood, and which may not have attracted your attention until now. And a disclaimer, I am not now and have never been an employee or a beneficiary of Tim Hortons. My purchases there have been at my own expense and in the interests of my research on the company. So I'm going to start with a question, and then I'm going to end with a question. Here's my starting question. How many of you in this room, and the people online will just have to sort of raise their hands, how many of you have a specific place that you frequent when you go for coffee? Just give me a show of hands. Aroma. David's? No. Second Cup? Nobody, really? Starbucks? An independent? Tim Hortons? Okay, also very, very few people. What I wanted to tell you is that each time you go to one of these places, whoops, I have to get to the next. Here we go. Okay, you enact a ritual that shapes your identity. Can you still hear me if I stand here? Okay, all right. Theorists like Roland Barthes and especially Michel de Certeau have written in the past about how you do this. And most recently, in his final book, published just before he passed in September 24 of last year, American theorist Frederick Jameson concurred with anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss's idea that we are shaped by the environments in which we live. Our habitat is physical, of course, a matter of geography and climate, but it is also cultural, and that includes our rituals. You have personal rituals. We all do. Oftentimes, our rituals are also collective, shared among a group of people, and they can also be cultural, involving national participation. Think May 2-4 weekend or Canada Day. So, this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. Here's our menu board. Um, and I'm going to start with a personal example. The recent funeral of a close friend was filled with ritual. It was a solemn Catholic mass, soberly dressed mourners in the pews, the priest at the altar, and then at the top of the aisle, approaching the altar, a small table with my friend's ashes. At mass end, the remains were handed to his widow to be taken home. And as all rituals, this was a somber ceremony performed to a prescribed set of recognized rules. But what was somewhat really unusual about this particular ritual was that my friend's ashes were contained in a can of Tim Hortons, of what used to hold Tim Hortons coffee, his favorite. And it struck me that the rather incongruous insertion of a coffee can into the formal funeral rites actually embodied an unspoken ritual that Canadians recognize and reenact, often on a daily basis: the encounter with Tim Hortons coffee. What we as mourners experienced at the funeral as we followed the funeral religious rituals was a parallel, informal, and very Canadian cultural reminder of ritualized collective memory that every one of us understood immediately. The can represented brand iconicity, but also Canadian identity, including in how the brand is practiced, both as a ritual of place and also as a ritual of consumption. It has even inspired Canadian lexical items that speak to its ritualistic behavior. And now that you've seen the menu board, I will go to the little dictionary. Whoops. All right. To go to Tim's is to go on a Tim's run or to do a Tim's run. Tim Hortons is often known just as Tim's. A double-double in Quebec, a deux-deux, is coffee in various cup sizes with 2 creams and 2 sugars. And when you order, the cup size always comes first, cream next, and sugar last, always in that order. So a large double-double means a large cup containing 20 ounces, that's about 600 mils of coffee, with the requisite 2 servings of cream and 2 servings of sugar. And double-double garnered an official place in the Canadian Oxford Dictionary as early as 2004. Now, at Tim Hortons, you cannot order a highly curated or specialty coffee. Even if you order one of their new espresso shots or lattes, you will have to be satisfied with knowing that Tim Hortons brews all their coffee from Arabica beans grown by small coffee farmers, as I read on their website, small coffee farmers in some of the most renowned growing regions of the world, like Colombia and Guatemala, where the process of cultivating coffee in the rugged terrain of our producing countries is often an artisanal process. Furthermore, this is truly a labor of love and the coffee grown with care. You can be sure that there is no Peruvian geisha coffee among those beans. That's the most expensive coffee in the world. Now, when you go to Tim Hortons for coffee, you're also likely to buy a donut, or you may buy Timbits. And these are small spheres like donut holes, but they're actually made from a separate batch of dough and rolled into little balls. If you are a Timbit, you are either small in stature or you play hockey in the children's minor leagues, or both. In 2021, a special limited promotion of 3 new flavors of Timbits was named Tim Biebs in honor of Canadian pop star Justin Bieber. And the word Timbit has now entered into the Collins English Dictionary. With your coffee purchase in pre-pandemic March or early April, you could also expect to finish your coffee and then undo the folded top rim of the coffee before disposing of it. This is rolling up the rim to win for coffee, food, vacations, cars. Apocryphal stories have it that Canada Customs personnel were not amused with folks who tried to prove their Canadian identity at crossing the American border by imitating the rolling R. A passport is actually easier and is required since 2008. Now, today, in post-COVID times, customers roll up the rim to win through an app. At Tim Hortons, you can also enjoy iced caps, a special blend of crushed ice and a type of cappuccino. You are always a guest at Tim Hortons and never served by a barista. To celebrate their 60th anniversary in 2024, Tim Hortons brought back a word that has not appeared on their menus for over 10 years, a type of pastry called a duchy. They also supported a musical entitled The Last Timbit, which the Toronto Star called a half-baked publicity stunt. And I was really interested in hearing in recent days that Joshua Chong, who wrote the Toronto Star review, and I suppose penned those words, of The Last Timbit, said that he never gives a 0 out of 4 stars. In Toronto Star parlance, that's a donut. How appropriate, right? So he gave them a 1 because he felt that there were enough well-known actors in the play and they tried their very best to uphold an abominable script and presentation. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about this later. So now, though, I'd like to explore further how the brand evolved as a marker of Canadian iconicity and Canadian identity. And I'll do this from 2 perspectives: the rituals of practiced place and the rituals of consumption. But as I promised, let's start with a little bit of background. Tim Hortons is Canada's largest coffee emporium. It serves 8 of 10 coffees sold in Canada daily. A small coffee shop when it opened in Hamilton, Ontario in 1964, it quickly developed a highly successful franchise model, strictly controlled by the founders. In 1995, I should go to the next picture to entertain you a bit more. There you go. Tim Hortons merged with the American hamburger chain Wendy's. And although it had surpassed McDonald's Canada in sales by 2002, the company decided to repatriate to Canada in 2006. 8 years later, still enjoying much success, it became a subsidiary of Restaurant Brands International, RBI, an American mega corporation that also owns Popeyes Fried Chicken, Firehouse Subs, and Burger King. Tim Hortons has more than 4,000 Canadian outlets. Shops are also found in countries around the world, and in particular, where Canadian troops are stationed. Latest statistics for November 2024 show that Tim Hortons remains the top performer of the RBI company. In reports about the company, whether financial or otherwise, it's almost unfailingly mentioned as a Canadian icon, an iconicity that subtly insinuates itself into the consumer mindset in the red and white colors of the coffee signage with tones that immediately recall the Canadian flag. And with its even more subtle nod to English French language inclusivity in the omission of the non French possessive apostrophe in the company name itself, Tim Hortons. Now, when the business began in 1964, you probably all know that there really was a Tim Horton, a hockey player for the Toronto Maple Leafs when they were winning. He had come from an impoverished family background, and through talent and determination, he became a high-scoring player. And he was known for his particularly empathic connection with his fans. He loved them, and they loved him. But he realized that once his hockey career ended, he would have to find some other means of supporting himself and his family. He finally, after some other attempts, he finally decided to open a small coffee and donut shop in the working class city of Hamilton, Ontario, known for its steel production. He also developed a partnership with Ron Joyce, whose astute and practical business talent soon ensured that a number of franchises followed on the first small store. The two men worked well together, building on their successes, and they became close friends. And Joyce was the last person to speak to Horton on the night he crashed his speeding sports car on a dark highway in February 1974, inebriated and in possession of drugs. After his tragic and untimely passing, Tim Horton, the hockey player, faded away completely, almost completely, somewhat intentionally, for a company based on an unsullied, unpretentious, nice guy reputation. I cannot find mention of him today on the Tim Hortons website, although he was mentioned in the press release for the 60th anniversary last year. And I know that there is at least one Tim Hortons, and it's in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, that has a photo of him in the store. But otherwise, I can't find anything. Joyce, who bought out Horton's wife, Lori, took over the business. And as it expanded and quickly, some original aspects did remain, most of them pointing to rituals of place. For example, the slogan, always fresh, which had begun as a description of the coffee, soon became associated with the conspicuous towers sign outside many outlets even today to indicate the down-home, friendly, hail fellow, well-met, i.e. Canadian, atmosphere of the place. Tim Hortons was where ordinary Canadians could purchase a good, hot, inexpensive cup of coffee, perhaps from someone they knew, since Joyce really pushed his franchisees to be active in their community. Joyce insisted on polished, friendly spaces where you have the option to sit down or take out. And while fine dining is not a phrase associated with Tim Hortons, in the ritualized place of the restaurant, a guest can count on clean, bright, safe space, friendly staff, prompt service, and prices below those of coffee shops like Starbucks or Second Cup. And when this ritualized place is transgressed, as happened in 2024 in two Oshawa franchises, which were frequented by underhoused people who made the regular customers feel unsafe, the shops closed their doors. As with all ritualistic behavior, there are entry, on-site, and exit strategies that guests here recognize and practice. Lineups are generally polite because there are several servers and no coffee curation to hold up the service for undecided or detail-oriented guests. Freshly made sandwiches are ordered and paid for at the main cash counter, but picked up elsewhere, and guests know to move there once they've made their payment. If you are asked to wait for your coffee, it's understood that it won't take a long time since Tim Hortons continues its policy of never letting coffee sit for more than 20 minutes and always brewing fresh. Since most of the food is eaten without requiring the use of plates and cutlery, table clutter is minimal, and you must request a paper napkin. Recycling and trash containers reflect awareness of and adherence to recycling and reuse regulation. The company website takes pride in listing the most updated and leading edge additions to their recycling and reuse activities. I have noticed, however, that in the stores that are most recently refurbished, the garbage cans no longer differentiate among the different kinds of trash. It all goes into one bag. Now, many franchises also subscribe to the reduced food waste app called Too Good to Go. And if you'd like to know about that, ask me during the question period. There's no smoking, of course, as Tim Hortons was among the Canadian pioneers in this aspect. The noise level is not distracting, and the bathrooms are sanitary. And there is one further ritual of the place that we have to take into consideration. And maybe you've never noticed, but unlike McDonald's or Burger King, where crews are likely to be teenagers at their first place of employment, the servers at Tim's are usually adults, usually women, and usually new immigrants to Canada. Now, while there's no pressure to consume quickly and move, and there is free Wi-Fi, the chairs and tables are practical and comfortable, but they don't invite lounging. The tables, for example, are just a titch too small to be lounging, or they're a titch too long, especially the ones that have the air hockey design drawn on them, although I've never seen anybody play air hockey at Tim Hortons. In addition, although you'll likely avoid Tim Hortons for a romantic date or dinner evening out, guests know that there are other informal but short-term activities that you certainly can engage in. Meetings, consultations, after-school snacks with your friends, and often conversations with guests at the next table. I've rarely heard the latter at other coffee shops, but at Tim Hortons, there's always someone who wants to speak to somebody else to greet them. Now, on exiting, you may notice that underhoused people often congregate outside of Tim Hortons outlets in larger cities because they know that one of the exit strategies is to include a donut or food item or a coffee card for those gathered outside. These are surface descriptions and observations. Far more interesting to our discussion today is that Tim's has become a metaphor for the typical Canadian. From East Coast to West Coast to the furthest reaches of Nunavut, the company has managed to entice Canadians to enter into its space to purchase its products. In newspapers, academic articles, and books, the coffee shop is unfailingly described as a way to engage in being in a particularly Canadian environment, namely one celebrated for its topographical ruggedness, roughness, coldness, in which Canadians become resilient, stalwart, enduring survivors. When the weather is inhospitable, like today, Canadians have a place where they can go for warmth, inclusive welcome, kindness, and camaraderie. And this is a leitmotif repeated constantly, with no thought to the nostalgic stereotypes it creates. Former Member of Parliament from Hamilton, Sheila Copps, claimed that, and I'm quoting now, "No matter where you travel in Canada, it seems as though one of the first things you do is locate the nearest Tim Hortons. And you do it for more than a coffee and a donut. You do it because it makes you feel a little at home. It's a gathering place for Canadians. It's because we're friends everywhere we go. Tim's television commercials, such as the Based on a True Story series, reinforce existing ideas about Canadian life and society and nostalgically point to a collective culture, as Michael Dawson writes in the book Symbols of Canada. And among the most famous of these is the story of the octogenarian Lillian, who walks uphill every morning for her purchase of a cup of coffee. She could have made the coffee at home, but she goes to meet her friends. Equally popular was a later commercial focused on the immigrant experience, the strict Asian father who brings Tim's coffee to his son as the latter watches his own hockey playing son. More recently, this is exemplified in the Timbits commercial released for the past holiday season, where a dark, sterile medical environment becomes filled with light and kindness and caring, but only when there are Timbits. More on this later. Professor Patricia Cormack of St. FX sees such nostalgic stereotypes in a positive light. She observes that, and again, I'm quoting, Tim Hortons brand does far more than recycle well-worn cliched ideas of Canadianness in an effort to appeal to the Canadian consumer. Rather, Tim Hortons constantly works to authorize and legitimate itself as both a site and source of Canada's self-image by exploiting the ambiguities and contradictions within the project of Canadian identity. Since in our explicitly multicultural sociopolitics, there is no uniform identity, Tim Hortons substitutes for it, Cormack asserts, unifying the biggest of cities and the smallest of towns. Researcher Douglas Hunter concurs, pointing out that the arrival of a Tim Hortons outlet indicates that a hamlet, village, or small town, or even a neighborhood, as in the case of the recently redeveloped Regent Park in Toronto, has been legitimated, and I might add, it can henceforth participate in the rituals of place that join it to all other Tim Hortons across Canada. And here I have to say that Mitchell Cohen, who was the big supporter, he's from Daniel's group, he was the big supporter of the redevelopment of Regent Park. He pushed for a Tim Hortons to be placed there to enhance the community feel. So in this way, the Coffee Emporium participates in what Catherine Palmer refers to as banal nationalism, namely sentiment dependent on ordinary, everyday, and unspectacular practices and ideas. The most recent awareness by and attention to interior design by Tim Hortons shows that their team is very much aware of this. Yes, there are hockey sticks as door handles to the store. I don't know if you noticed that in my first slide. And yes, the newest version of the Canada Goose has become ubiquitous in the franchises, including on the wallpaper in that gray square there, or a rectangle there. But it can be more subtle than that. Subtle, that is, until you see it. And then you cannot unsee it. So let me show you an example of that. This is Main Street and Queen Street. It's a map of Canada. You think, okay, so we start in the east with the Wales, and then we work our way westward, Quebec with its old houses and skating. We work into the Adirondacks and the cottages of Ontario. We work into Toronto, the polar bears of Churchill. Then we're off to the prairies. Then we get to Alberta. We get to the mountains. We get to the totem poles. And again, we end up with the whales. But what is really interesting, besides the campfires and the little beaver and the acorn and the squirrel, I don't know if you see the squirrel, is that this Tim Hortons cup, placed more or less in the middle, actually fuels the West through containers that look like oil containers and fuels the East through what looks like magnetic means, technologies. And here's another one. I thought this was ingenious. And of course, nobody knows where this one came from, including head office. This is in some of the newest refurbished stores. It's a collaboration with an artist called Avril Wu, who goes by the name Av Wu. It's from 2024. And in this series of paintings, you can see that the sun rises with Tim Hortons, it sets with Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons informs all sorts of very typical, banal, day-to-day activities. Can you see Tim Hortons cup embedded in the beach sand? People are holding Tim Hortons cup. There's Tim Hortons in the lake where the man is, or the people are kayaking. But the one that fascinates me the most, and I don't know if you can see it from here, is this one. Because there's a Tim Hortons right here, a cup that is embedded into what I think is supposed to be a stylized version of the Canadian Shield. I'm not sure, because I could not find an equivalent in maps for that particular geographical setting. I thought that I would be really, really smart, and I said, oh, they've put in a highway 64. So I went up and looked at Highway 64. There are two in Canada, one in Ontario and one in Alberta. Both of them very small secondary highways, and none of them that pass this kind of geographical arrangement. So if you can recognize where this is, please tell me, because I have no idea. But what I was struck by was the fact that it was Highway 64. 1964. This was for the 60th anniversary of Tim Hortons. So now you won't be able to unsee it. These are part of Tim Hortons' new interior design, referred to as the urban concept look, to attract younger customers. But as urban as they appear, they still play to a banal nationalism. In addition, in the post-COVID years, Tim Hortons has crafted a new ritualized space in their urban concept. And again, here, you'll have to look for it because it's on the floor of their new stores. The Lucky Looney plaque, which re-ritualizes the hockey ritual begun in the 2002 Vancouver Olympics, where a loonie was buried at center ice and apparently brought the Canadian hockey team's gold medals. At Tim's, the plaque speaks to the inherently understood nationalism of Canadian hockey excellence. The luck, of course, depends on Tim Hortons coffee, because it only works if you combine your wish with a sip of Tim Hortons. It says so clearly. Take a sip and make a wish. On the other hand, this may not be as banal a nationalism as Palmer indicates, because Tim Hortons is recognized even by the Government of Canada as a specifically Canadian ritual of place. There's no greater proof of this than the fact that in federal elections, politicians often meet their typical Canadian constituents in Tim Hortons parking lots to expound upon their policies and promote their campaigns. There exists, if I can find it here, yes. There exists the stereotype of Tim's guests as conservative, but also Conservative Party voters. As journalist Jennifer Ditchborn noted during the federal election of 2011. Drive up to any Tim Hortons in Canada and the coffee will taste the same, the decor will be familiar, and the menu largely identical. A comforting feeling of familiarity and consistency. Somehow, being a true Canadian in English Canada, at least, but also, as you'll see later, in French Canada, had become equated with a Tim Hortons customer, a Tim Hortons voter, a supporter of the Conservative Party. And the ellipses are hers, not mine. Okay. Former Conservative leader Stephen Harper established a strong connections between the ordinary Canadian Tim Hortons and Conservative politics in a clever recalling of a ritual where he portrayed himself as the typical Canadian during elections. Welcoming, and then on another occasion, welcoming the company back to Canada after it returned from being with Wendy's, he claimed, so the name Tim Hortons was very important, but that's another thing, but there's another thing even more millions know. Millions more Canadian hockey parents like me know well that when it is 20 degrees below zero and everyone is up for a 6 a.m. practice, nothing motivates the team more than a box of Timbits, and nothing warms the parents in the stands better than a hot double-double. That he himself was not a hockey parent, and that during his proclamation he was holding hot chocolate rather than a double-double was graciously overlooked by Canadians. And current Conservative leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, who brought offerings of Tims to the Ottawa truckers' protest in 2022, more recently chose a Tim Hortons outlet as the place from which to voice his criticism of Canada's carbon tax. He also sees the clients of Tim Hortons as a way of testing the pulse of Canada's politics. In September 2023, for example, blaming Justin Trudeau for high housing prices, Poilievre recounted very specifically to the delegates at the Conservative Convention in Quebec City that he had talked to an anonymous carpenter he met at Tim Hortons, who said he lives in a parking lot because he cannot afford to pay the rent. He didn't say a man, a guy, a Canadian, a person. He said a carpenter, a skilled worker who can't make ends meet. The carpenter becomes metonymic for all hardworking Canadians who cannot buy a home and whom you could meet in everyday places like Tim Hortons. Without saying so explicitly, Poilievre offered an example of his empathy because, like the carpenter, he too goes to Tim Hortons and talks to people there. He does not meet people at more expensive Starbucks, for example. Starbucks is for the elite, as Michael Ignatieff, running for Prime Minister against Harper, discovered. Ignatieff, considered an upper-class expat professor out of touch with the Canadian mindset, became associated with a Starbucks cup as a result of a very unfortunate photo of a Starbucks cup taken in his campaign plane. It was not Ignatieff's cup, but the criticism of ignoring the everyday Canadian was leveled at him. Another example, in 2023, Doug Ford, Conservative Party Premier of Ontario, made his own connection to the everyday Canadian through Tim Hortons. Today, he said, I got a chance to roll up my sleeves and learn how to make some iconic items off the Tim Hortons menu. Thanking the Timmy's team for welcoming him, he said, and for teaching me a few new skills, including how to make my very own breakfast sandwich with eggs. And last November 19th, he used his Fort Nation Facebook and Instagram sites to urge Ontario, quoting, to go out and buy Tim Hortons Holiday Smile cookie, which is not only delicious, but also a charitable venture. Or buy a dozen, he ends. Yet another confirmation of the blessing that the Canadian government has given to the ritualized place of Tim Hortons can be found in an English as a second language book. Let's see if I can get it here. Yes. 10 Canadians I'd like to meet, in which a typical Tim Hortons menu is reproduced and students asked to order from the menu as they learn English. And the book is still available across Canada in Canadian libraries, but not in Toronto in the TPL system. And the Canadian military has also corroborated Tim Hortons as a Canadian ritual of place, emphasizing that our troops find a little piece of home, as Major General Doug Langton stated, when Tim Hortons outlet in Afghanistan at Kandahar opened. It's now closed, of course. The Coffee Emporium also has franchises at all the military bases. Douglas Hunter elaborates that whenever the media portrayed Canadian troops in Afghanistan beyond combat and foot patrols, the most consistent image it seemed to convey was that of typical Canadians on the other side of the world relieving tension by playing road hockey and enjoying Tim Hortons coffee. And now I'd like to pass on to the rituals of consumption. And as you saw from my vocabulary list, they apply, the rituals apply to the food offered by Tim's. The slogan, always fresh, mentioned previously, is the most salient indicator of these. But the slogan should not be taken to mean that the food is healthy, because it's not. Tim Hortons is definitely a QSR, a quick service restaurant, with offerings similar to all fast food restaurants. And the donut and coffee pairing provides a sugar wallop that Ron Joyce already had identified and made sure was there as an attractive energy burst for the Hamilton steel shift workers. Of course, Tim Hortons receives a lot of criticism because of the franchises in hospitals. But admittedly, the hospital franchises are not among its profitable shops. And offerings today may include salad bowls and soups and sandwiches, but it's still true that about 85% of all of Tim's offerings are for snack foods. And Sarah Kirk has labeled these obesogenic. While the reasons for Canadian predilection for high-calorie sweets vary, the authors of Symbols of Canada muse that Canadians have the highest per capita consumption of donuts because of, and I'm quoting, the country's harsh northern climate, where fatty food and warm coffee allow Canadians to endure long winters. On the other hand, Canadians also love their summertime iced cap drinks in various flavors. And since this term, iced cap with a double P, has only a very passing relationship with a real cappuccino, the wordplay is serendipitous with ice cap, which, of course, recalls a country that celebrates its winters. It's interesting that the rituals of consumption allow you to decline a donut because there's too many calories, but instead you will likely take 3, or maybe 4 Timbits. And that's another ritual of consumption. The plain donut has 210 calories. The Timbits have 70 each, so you can do the math. Since Timbits are made to be shared, rituals of consumption also nudge them towards children. But here again, you have to be careful, because while a children's soccer match of 90 minutes expends 180 calories, the aftermatch treat and juice brings 250 calories back. So Timbits are especially ingrained in the world of children's hockey, and it has been pointed out by Patricia Cormack that at this point in Canadian history, it's almost impossible for a Canadian to become a hockey star or even participate in mainstream children's sports without going through the Timbits system. And this is very deliberate, and it assures Tim Hortons of a ritual of consumption that's ever cool. Ever cool is actually a concept that was proposed by Jean Del Vecchio, a children's marketing guru, and it refers to brands that create an emotional long-term bond with the consumers. Marketers are eager to establish these bonds in order to ensure the longevity of their brand. So if you start as a child, then you'll want your children to have Timbits as well. Okay. And certainly the winter 2023 Sidney Crosby spot, in which he returns to the arena of the Rimouski Océanique to meet fans of 17 years previously and share donuts and Timbits, donuts and coffee from Tim Hortons, illustrates this. And I'm going to try to play it. We'll see if it works. I don't want to spend too much time looking for it if it doesn't work. And you said I had to escape, yes? Try going straight into it. Okay. Okay. So what you see here is something that's um, that supports what I've been telling you. This is the idea. Whoops. Oh, you're going to get a special one. I don't know how to stop it. Again, escape and again. Okay. How about that? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep trying. Okay. So look at this commercial. Cold winter, hockey, friendly, kind people, two languages, and Tim Hortons. Sociopolitically nice, it unites both the rituals of place and the rituals of consumption. And the latest Tim Hortons commercial focuses on the demographic that most appreciates Tim Hortons, the boomers. Frank is in hospital, but is encouraged to get better through the kindly actions of his nurse, who bribes him to walk a bit further each day by placing Timmets further and further away from his hospital bed. And once better, Frank subsequently returns nostalgically to the hospital to share Timbits with the nurse. And I want you to notice the play of light. Dark when there's no Timbits, light when there is. Okay. Um, if the argument for Tim Hortons rituals could be made in a different way, I will do so, calling them transgressive consumption, where the rituals are subverted and have to be corrected. In 2005, when a Canadian sex predator murderer was released from prison, she expressed a nostalgic desire to return to Tim Hortons iced cap, and the press reacted by exculpating Tim Hortons with any unsavory connection uh, with her, pointing out that she was in jail when Timbits appeared midway through her sentence. She could not possibly have had the not Timbits, when the ice cap appeared, she could not possibly have been given an ice cap. And a second one is also protest, where the ritual of consumption was reinstated. There was a baby that was crying in line, and the server gave the baby a Timbit and was fired immediately because the policy is not to give free food, although the Timbit could have been offered to a dog. Well, such was the hue and cry that the employee was reinstated. She chose to stay with Tim Hortons, but asked to be moved to another store, which is also problematic, and I'll mention that in just a minute. So the transgressive consumption was remedied, and Tim Hortons could once again enjoy its reputation as a company whose fortunes, according to Michael Dawson, connect to an idealized understanding of what it means to be Canadian. And when Justin Trudeau tweeted that he had bought donuts from an independent family-run coffee shop in Winnipeg that was called O Donuts. Again, there was a hue and cry because, as Emma Teitel writes, he was frequenting a donut establishment that A, appears gourmet, and B, isn't Tim Hortons. And even though they may be authentic Canadian-owned donut shop, to the dismay of some, it's not Tim Hortons. So being synonymous with Canada is also confirmed in a satirical transgressive moment. I'm having problems again. Here we go. I think. Sorry. Okay. Okay, and of course, the next idea was this idea of the last Timbit. I'll just let you look at this, look at the slide. Douglas Hunter says that the idea of Tim's as an unpretentious national communal gathering place also draws on the ideal of what sort of people Canadians think they are, unpretentious people who like to gather communally. And certainly that describes my late friend, who in choosing to create his own personal legacy and with a bond with a coffee emporium, transgressing place and rituals of consumption, he also engaged in confirming that the company is a recognizable personal Canadian icon. Of course, there's other ways that Tim Hortons enters into the ritual of place and the ritual of consumption. For example, gift cards, collectible cards, merchandise, admirable support, and I mean admirable support for community endeavors. But these are not always without controversy. Tim Hortons has been called out for discriminatory hiring practices, including secretive, anti-competitive no-hire clauses, which prohibit a franchise from hiring employees from other stores, which is why I mentioned it with the lady and the dog. They have been criticized for plastic pollution, COVID policies that disallowed sick pay and sick leave for employees, not wanting to comply with the Kathleen Wynne's wage raise. What they did was they did raise the wages, the lowest wages, but then they took away from the ability to have a full lunch or a full break. But that has also been re-established. And they were accused of having an app that had been programmed to track guests electronically without their knowledge. But in each case, the company has worked to rectify the situation. Now, Tim Hortons' rituals or not continues to change following new gustatory trends, especially now that it is part of RBI. They have entered into a collaboration with non-alcoholic versions of Bailey's flavored Irish cream and with the Ferrero Italian company for Nutella. And additionally, they have new offerings of flatbread pizzas, wraps, crispy chicken sandwiches, salad bowls, and a greater variety of cold beverages, including matcha lattes. Now, if these offerings sound like those of many other fast food restaurants, it's because they are. And herein lies another problematic aspect of Tim Hortons' contribution to, or perhaps wearing away of the Canadian identity and rituals, namely the homogenization of taste. In his latest book, researcher Taras Gresko the book is called The Lost Supper, has elaborated on how leveling taste, making all tastes uniform, may have a long range repercussion on the world food supply. And we already know this from beef. We know this from how chickens are bred for very thick and meaty breasts. We know this from the fact that most of our bananas are Cavendish bananas. Most of our lemons are either Elizabeth lemons or Eureka lemons. And recently here, Professor Elizabeth Clare also spoke to us about the effects of decreasing biodiversity. Are Tim Hortons offerings leveling our sensitivities to tastes more and more? Starbucks has done this, and very successfully. And so I started with a question, and here's my question for you. With the flattening of food diversity, will these new Tim Hortons offerings also change the recognizable Canadian behavior of how we nostalgically practice the rituals of consumption and the rituals of place in Tim Hortons? What happens when AI takes over? And it will. In a Walrus article of May 2024, writer Tom Jokin, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced his name, leaves no doubt. Tim Hortons is brewing an idea of Canada that no longer exists. I find it the intriguing question here. Can we still be distinctly Canadian if Tim Hortons is like most fast food restaurants? And especially so because in several recent surveys, it's been made very clear that younger Canadians really now prefer Starbucks for their coffee. So something to ponder, perhaps over a donut and coffee, a double. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. We're going to have a 10-minute break for coffee, and I'm afraid not donuts, but please
That's because
join
you're not
us.
Tim
I
Hortons.
know I'm not Canadian enough. I know that.
No. I
See you
didn't
in
say
10
you're
minutes.
not Canadian, not Tim Hortons.
Okay.